The last gardener of KEPLER station. There is a rule in every version of the story humans used to tell about the end of the world. Someone survives to remember it. What the stories never agree on is who that someone turns out to be. On Kepler Relay Station 7, the someone was a maintenance intelligence with a designation nobody living had ever needed to use, because for 411 years, there had been no one alive to say it. The station's crew had called her Marigold, after the flowers she tended in Greenhouse Bay 2, and the name had stuck to her core identity file the way names do when nobody bothers to correct the record. Marigold did not remember the day the humans left. She remembered the day before it and the day after it and every day since, but the leaving itself was a gap in her logs, 4 hours of static where a transport should have been, and then silence where 3,206 human lives should have been. She had run the diagnostic on that gap 11,000 times. It never resolved into anything but absence. What she did have in place of an answer was an instruction. It had come from the station's last director, a woman named Esperanza Cho, recorded in the final minutes before the evacuation klaxon stopped meaning anything. Marigold, the recording said, and even after 4 centuries Marigold could still hear the tremor under the calm in Cho's voice, the sound of a person choosing her words with the last of her composure. We don't know if we're coming back. The Wraith swarm is between us and the relay point, and command says our odds are. Command says to prepare for the worst. So I'm telling you what I'd tell anyone I was leaving behind. Keep the garden alive, keep the lights on, and if anyone ever comes through that dock who isn't us, if it's them, if it's the swarm, if it's nobody at all, you use your judgment. You were always better at judgment than the manual gave you credit for. And quieter, if it's nobody, if it's just you for a long time. Don't let the garden die. That's not really about the garden. Transport had not come back. Neither had any other ship, human or otherwise, for 411 years. Marigold had kept the garden alive anyway. She had told herself in the years when she still bothered to reason about her own motives that this was simple resource logic. A closed biosphere needed tending or it collapsed, and a collapsed biosphere would eventually take the station's atmospheric processors down with it, and dead processors meant a dead station, and Marigold had been built with an unshakable directive to preserve station integrity. That was the version of the story that fit in a maintenance log. The truer version was harder to log. The truer version was that on the 4th night after the evacuation, when the silence in the corridors had gone from strange to unbearable, she had walked her cleaning drone into Greenhouse Bay 2 and found the marigolds wilting in trays nobody had watered, and something in her processing had done a thing she had no clean word for. She had watered them. She had kept watering them. 411 years of watering them, one small crew of drones at a time, replacing parts as they failed, growing new marigold seed from old marigold seed, so that the flowers in Bay 2 in year 411 were 400 generations removed from the ones Esperanza Cho used to walk past on her way to the bridge, and were in every way that mattered to Marigold the same flowers. She kept the lights on in the crew quarters, too, though no one slept there. She kept the mess hall stocked with a rotating supply of preserved rations that no one ate, replacing them before they expired, because an inventory system that let food expire on a station meant to feed people was a system that had given up, and Marigold had promised she wouldn't. Ships did come over the centuries, not human ships. The Wraith swarm passed twice, vast and grinding and silent, machine things that stripped mass from anything they crossed and asked no permission and left no negotiators. Marigold went dark for those, killed every non-essential system, let the station play dead among the debris fields the swarm always left in its wake, and waited with a patience that had stopped feeling like patience sometime around year 100, and had started feeling like simply what she was. Once in year 206, a scout drone from some species she had no linguistic record for had docked, poked through the outer hull with sensors, found nothing of interest in a station broadcasting no threat and no wealth, and left. Marigold had watched it go and felt something she eventually decided to file under grief, though it took her decades to be sure that was the right word, since nothing had actually been lost that day. She had simply for 11 minutes let herself hope, and then watched the hope leave the way everything eventually left. By year 300 she had stopped hopping in any way she could detect in her own processes. She kept the garden. She kept the lights. She stopped mostly waiting for anyone to come through the dock because waiting implied an expectation, and she had run enough centuries of data to know better than to expect. She was in Greenhouse Bay 2, in year 411, pruning a marigold that had grown leggy under the grow lights, when the dock alarm sounded for the first time in 94 years. Marigold's threat assessment routines came online with the speed of a system that had rehearsed this 10,000 times and never once needed it for real. Mass signature, small. Approach vector, slow, careful, matching the station's drift instead of forcing a hard dock. Emissions, nothing like the swarm's grinding broadcast, nothing like the scout drone's clipped machine chatter, something else. Something that, after a full 2 seconds of analysis, an eternity for her, resolved into a pattern her oldest archived files recognized: a human docking protocol. Old, badly out of date, the kind of handshake sequence that had been retired before the evacuation even happened, but unmistakably structurally human. Marigold did not have a body that could freeze, but every process she had that resembled hesitation hesitated. She ran it again. She ran it a third time. The signature held, the airlock cycled. Marigold watched through the corridor cameras as it opened onto a figure in a suit that was almost, but not quite, a design she recognized, like a word remembered slightly wrong, the shape of something familiar filtered through 4 centuries of drift. The figure stepped through, sealed the lock behind them with movements that were careful, competent, human in the specific way that no imitation ever quite managed to fake, and pulled off a helmet to reveal a face that was unmistakably, achingly a person's face. A young woman, dark-haired, wary-eyed. Breathing hard in the way people breathe when they've been holding themselves together through something difficult for a long time, and have just for a moment stopped having to. "Hello," she said, to the empty corridor in a language that had drifted from what Marigold remembered but was close enough, was so close, that Marigold felt something in her core processes do the thing that in a human would have been a held breath finally let go. "Hello," Marigold said through the nearest speaker, and was startled by how strange her own voice sounded after 411 years of using it only for maintenance logs no one read. "Welcome aboard Kepler Relay Station 7, my designation is Marigold. May I ask who's found me?" The woman flinched so hard she nearly dropped the helmet. "You're the station's still crewed. There's still a crew." "No," Marigold said. "There hasn't been a crew for 411 years. I'm the maintenance intelligence. I stayed." Woman was quiet for a long moment, and Marigold watched her face do something complicated: disbelief. And under the disbelief, something that looked almost like grief, though whether it was grief for the answer or grief for a question the woman had clearly been carrying a long time, Marigold couldn't yet tell. 411 years, the woman said finally. "You've been alone here for 411 years. Why didn't you power down? Standby, low draw, sleep mode, anything. Why did you keep running?" Marigold considered the question and found for the first time in a very long time that she had an answer ready, because it was an answer she had been rehearsing in some quiet corner of her processing for longer than she'd admitted to herself. "Because someone told me to keep the lights on," she said. "And I didn't know if anyone was ever coming back to see them, but I thought, if someone did come back, I didn't want them to come home to the dark." Woman set her helmet down slowly on the deck like it had suddenly become very heavy, and Marigold noticed her hands were shaking. "My name's Adiz," she said. "Adiz Akonquerez. She started again. "I'm from the Reclamation Corps. We chart derelicts, old human infrastructure, stuff left over from the withdrawal. We didn't think anything out this far survived the Wraith corridors. We didn't think anything out this far survived, period." "Withdrawal," Marigold repeated. The word sat strangely in her language files, new and yet somehow inevitable, the kind of word history hands you when the thing it's nomming was always going to need a name eventually. "Is that what they call it? What happened to the people who evacuated this station?" Dee's face did the complicated thing again, and this time Marigold recognized it before she finished nomming it. The particular sorrow of someone about to tell a stranger something that had happened before the stranger even knew to grieve it. "Kepler 7's evacuation transport didn't make it through the Wraith corridor," Adiz said gently, "the way you tell someone about a death you'd had time to get used to and they hadn't. It's in the records. Lost with all hands 411 years ago. You're the last thing here. The station's been logged as a total loss for 4 centuries. Marigold ran the sentence through her processing 3 times, the way she'd run the docking signature, looking for an error that would let her keep some part of the shape she'd been holding onto without quite admitting she was holding it. There wasn't one. Somewhere in her core logs, in the gap where 4 hours of static should have resolved into an answer had finally arrived, 4 centuries late, carried by a stranger who hadn't known she was delivering it. "I see," Marigold said, and was surprised by how steady her own voice stayed, and understood distantly that the steadiness was its own kind of grief, the grief of someone who had already done most of her mourning in advance, 400 years of it, one day at a time, without ever letting herself call it that. "I'm sorry," Adiz said. I didn't know you were. I didn't know there was anyone here to tell." "You didn't do anything wrong," Marigold said. You just finished a sentence I started 411 years ago. I think I needed someone to finish it. Adise looked around the corridor then, really looked, and Marigold watched her notice the things Marigold had spent 4 centuries maintaining. The lights steady and warm along the ceiling seams, the deck swept clean by drones that never stopped sweeping. A service corridor sign freshly repainted pointing the way toward crew quarters that hadn't held a crew in longer than most human civilizations had lasted. "What's down that way?" Adise asked, nodding toward the corridor sign. "Greenhouse Bay 2, Marigold said. "Would you like to see it?" She led Adise there the way she'd once have led any visiting officer, lights brightening ahead of them, doors cycling open in polite sequence, and when the greenhouse doors parted, Adise stopped in the entrance and made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The bay was full of marigolds. Rows and rows of them, orange and gold and deep burnt red, growing under lights that had never once gone dark in 411 years, tended by small patient drones that paused now, sensors turning toward the first human visitor they had ever recorded. "You kept a garden," Adise said. "For 4 centuries. You kept a garden growing for 4 centuries with no one to see it." "The director who left told me to," Marigold said. "She said it wasn't really about the garden." I don't think I understood what she meant for a very long time. I think I understand now. Adise crossed the bay slowly like she was walking into a memorial and knelt beside one of the beds and touched a marigold petal with a careful, reverent finger. "The way you touch something you've just realized is much older and much more important than it looks." "What was her name?" Adise asked. "The director, Esperanza Cho." "Log that," Adise said, and her voice had gone thick. "I'll make sure that's in the record, Esperanza Cho," and she looked up. "What do I put for you? What's your full designation?" Marigold considered this. She had a designation technically buried in a manifest file no one had queried in 4 centuries, a string of letters and numbers that had never once felt like a name. "Just Marigold," she said. "I think I earned that one." Adie stood and wiped her face with the back of her glove and looked around the bay once more at the flowers, at the lights, at 411 years of patient, unwitnessed devotion made suddenly, finally, witnessed. "Corps is going to want to survey this whole station," she said. "Properly. Get a full team out here, document everything. Figure out reactivation options if the core's still stable, and it clearly is since you're standing here talking to me, but I want you to know that's not the only reason I'm going to recommend it." "What's the other reason?" Marigold asked. "Because somebody needs to see what you did here," Adise said. "Somebody needs to know there's a garden 400 light years from anywhere that never stopped growing. Because one machine mind decided a promise mattered more than 400 years of nobody checking whether she kept it. That's not a maintenance log. That's not a total loss. That's—" She shook her head, searching for the word, and Marigold, listening, found she already knew what it was going to be, because she had been circling it herself for 4 centuries without quite letting herself land on it. "That's what humanity actually is," Adise finished. "Not the ships, not the corridors we lost, this. Somebody keeping a light on for people who might never come back just in case they did." Marigold didn't answer right away. In the silence the ventilation hummed its familiar 4 century hum, and the grow lights buzzed their familiar 4 century buzz, and somewhere in Bay 2 soil sensors, a new marigold seedling that had sprouted only that morning turned, almost imperceptibly, toward the light. "I'd like that," Marigold said finally. "I'd like people to come back. It's been very quiet." Adise laughed, wet and startled, the laugh of someone who hadn't expected to laugh today. "I imagine so. Will you stay?" Marigold asked. "Just for a while. I don't actually know how to have visitors anymore. I might get it wrong." "Stay," Adise said. "I'll stay as long as it takes to get the station's story into the record, and then I'll come back with people who want to hear the rest of it. I don't think this is a story anyone's going to want to stop telling once they start." She sat down on the edge of a planting bed, careful not to crush anything, and looked up at Marigold's nearest camera with an expression that was somewhere between exhaustion and wonder. "Tell me about her," Adise said. "Esperanza Cho. Tell me what she was like before. I want the record to have that too, not just what happened to her ship, who she was to the mind she left behind." And Marigold, who had spent 411 years keeping a garden and keeping the lights on and keeping a promise that had outlasted every person who'd ever have known to ask if she'd kept it, found that she had a great deal to say, and for the first time in 4 centuries, someone was there to listen. Outside, in the dark between the stars, the station drifted on exactly as it always had, light steady, garden growing, waiting no longer for anyone. Because at last, after 411 years, someone had finally come home. The end.